Here in the Athenaeum, I've been hearing for years tales of this channel overly sarcastic productions that does work in historical and mythological content. Given my own inclinations, it seemed only natural that I would want to go check them out, perhaps add them to my collection of subscriptions. Seeing a few of their videos, it's totally clear to me that the hosts, Red and Blue, know what they're doing, and besides, their illustrations are gorgeous. So it was that I found myself watching their Hades and Persephone video, nodding along, occasionally learning something new. And then...
This is not helped by the fact that there's also a lot of widely accepted misinformation about the story in general and Persephone specifically. On one side, there's the misinterpretation that Persephone's abduction was a horrifyingly violent assault, which stems from the fact that the ancient word for kidnap has taken on much more unpleasant connotations over the centuries, which was not its original application in the story.
Okay, clearly we need to talk about Persephone. Hello and welcome. I'm Zilla, and this is my Athenaeum. Today I want to talk about the way that rape is presented in ancient Greek and Roman mythology, and in particular the myth of Persephone. So, content warning, sexual assault. Let's return briefly to what it is that Red said in her video that caught me off guard. I'll play it for you again.
The fact that the ancient word for kidnap has taken on much more unpleasant connotations over the centuries, which was not its original application in the story.
Now, again, I want to emphasize that Red and Blue clearly know what they're doing. There is a lot to love in this video, and in their channel in general. In fact, I recommend you go check them out. I take no umbrage with Red for repeating a talking point that I must have heard dozens of times in my career in ancient Mediterranean studies. But this is a really contentious topic among current classic scholars. Does the Greek verb harpazein, or the Latin rapere, from which we get our word rape, does it really mean to rape or just to abduct? Should we be translating this as kidnapping or as sexual assault, particularly in the case of Persephone? For generations of scholars, this was a question without purpose. After all, once a woman has been abducted, there's no longer a way to guarantee her virginity, and so what does it really matter? And besides, in the context of the Greek culture from which this myth comes, Zeus, as the father of Persephone, has every right to bestow her hand in marriage to Hades, regardless of what Demeter or Persephone wants. So, once they're married, it's not really rape, is it? Ugh. It feels gross just saying that. In more recent centuries, as the study of Greco-Roman antiquity became the province of elite education for the genteel Englishman, translations quietly started to elide all mentions of sexual assault. This is also around the time when translations start sanding the queerness off the edges of both mythological and historical stories. Things like Sappho's love of other women, or Julius Caesar's affairs with men. After all, rape and queer love, these are signs of degeneracy, decadence, the fall of the Roman monarchy that preceded the Republic, or the fall of the empire itself. Not something a reputable god would do. And so the words harpazein and rapere were translated more and more often with their less explicit meanings. After all, the same words that can mean to pluck a flower can be used to pluck a flower, if you catch my drift. And when I first read the Homeric hymn to Demeter in undergrad, this is how it was taught to me. Sure, Persephone was aekouson, unwilling, and she screamed at the top of her lungs for help, but she was just physically picked up and taken. But the more ancient literature you read in the original, the clearer it becomes that when the Greeks use harpazein, or the Romans use rapere, if the object is a person, it's almost always either implying or explicitly describing rape. The translations don't necessarily reflect this, but you have to remember that scholars are influenced in their translations by culture, and translation being the imperfect thing that it is, that can change a lot of how we see it. The culture said, don't talk about rape. So they didn't. Until recently. The up-and-coming generation of ancient world scholars is busy tearing down the walls of intersectional biases, not just in terms of people involved in the study, but also in terms of translation. Perhaps, if you're interested in such things, you've heard tell of Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, where she renders Odysseus's most famous epithet, polytropos, not as it is often translated, clever or tricky or even well-traveled, but as complicated. A much less flattering and more literal translation than any man had ever used. This one single word ricocheted around academic circles. I remember the first time I read it being stunned into silence by its elegant perfection. And yet, this simple change went against generations of scholarly tradition, and Wilson was immediately vilified by a cadre of old white men with tenure. That's just one relatively well-known example, but the trend is ongoing. And in the corners of the internet where forward-thinking scholars like to gather, such as Classics Twitter or the sadly no longer with us Eidolon Journal, words like harpazein and rapere and their translations have come under intense scrutiny. As the Me Too movement brought the focus of pop culture onto rape culture, papers started to be produced that took a really close look at how exactly the Greeks and Romans portrayed rape and sexual assault, and the harm it was doing when those works got translated without it. I want to emphasize here that this is really recent. The Me Too movement and Tarana Burke's really breakout moment didn't happen until 2017, and Amy Hines' article Rape or Romance that looks at this issue specifically didn't come out in Eidolon until 2019. So it's entirely possible for even somebody who does their research, who is well educated in the subject, to miss this, because most of the sources rely on what is now becoming an outdated talking point. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a lot of Persephone stories where someone has turned it into a romance. I absolutely adore the Lore Olympus webcomic, and I really enjoyed the Hades video game storyline. But these are reception, which is to say, taking an ancient story and turning it into a modern one, with different details, themes, and other pieces. And reception, while very interesting, holds a completely different place of importance than the study of the ancient mythology itself. Princess Weeks, a YouTuber who does just brilliant media analyses, recently did a video essay on why we find Persephone's story in particular so compelling that there are so many versions of it today. And she comes to a conclusion that I think is really brilliant, which is that in the story of Persephone, women and queer folks find a perspective that is easier to identify themselves in than in most of the stories of the ancient world that have been translated to us by these white men who have a very self-centered perspective.
It is the reason why people have taken this story with all its problematic layering and have tried to build a better narrative, not just in terms of the Hades-Persephone romance, but specifically with Persephone. Haha! Tricked it. This video is about feminism, baby. In a lot of these recreations, what they are trying to do is give Persephone more autonomy and more power in the modernization of the myth. And honestly, I think that's a great thing. On a deeper level, I believe people choose to humanize the Hades and Persephone relationship because unlike a lot of female deities who have a very fixed role, Persephone's main story is all about, again, her coming of age, being forced to go from girl to woman due to the acts of men.
When the scholarly bias has removed all of these queer and female perspectives from what we do have, it's not surprising that women and queer viewers want to see something of themselves in this story that is female-focused and involves the only marriage of two gods that seems to be even remotely functional. This trend is so prevalent that at the recent Antiquity and Media Studies conference, there was an entire panel just on Persephone reception. And many of the points made in it could be found either in the Overly Sarcastic Productions video or in Princess's longer essay.
Despite the references to the violent and non-consensual nature of Persephone's abduction to the underworld in ancient texts, such as the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which I have up on the slide, many modern depictions of the story of Hades and Persephone transform the kidnapping into a more benign love story, even though most of these modern authors and artists working in this genre cite the Homeric hymn to Demeter in particular, but ancient evidence at large as their sources. For example, Lore Olympus on the left, a popular webcomic by Rachel Smythe, even starts with a quote from the Loeb edition of the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And Punderworld by Lisa Sejic on the right cites the Homeric hymn to Demeter as her inspiration for the creation of her webcomic Punderworld. And you can see this squared off in blue. However, the non-consensual nature of the myth poses a problem for modern audiences, for whom explicit sexual assault is usually considered antithetical to romantic love. Perception authors prefer instead to render Hades blameless in their reimagining of the narrative, or if not blameless, then otherwise flawed, a loner, excessively grumpy, mean, or difficult, but no longer a perpetrator of sexual assault. This sanitization poses a narrative issue because it removes the catalyst that forces Persephone away from her mother, Demeter, and into the underworld. This paper explores one common narrative method, which is used to replace the impetus for Persephone's descent, the reassigning of blame from Hades to Demeter.
Our modern-day world knows Persephone myth well. The goddess of spring was kidnapped by the king of the dead. She became queen of the underworld for half the year, and her return to her mother and earth resulted in the renewal of spring. To many audiences, the myth is simple. It's an ideological story that explains the seasons. That scaled-down version of the myth lacks details of what actually happened to Persephone. She was abducted from her home, and as told in the ancient sources we have and many readings of them, she was raped by Hades. Arguments over the Persephone myth's modern-day reception focus on this distinct detail. Hades raped Persephone, and the myth is not and should not be told as a love story. I argue that Lore Olympus successfully creates a retelling of the Persephone myth as a love story, but Smythe reconstructs the myth very carefully in order to do so. I want to emphasize that the most important facet of Lore Olympus remains the Persephone-centric storyline. We see how Persephone reacts to and navigates so many different relationships throughout the webtoon. Her friendship and romance with Hades, her complicated mother-daughter bond with Demeter, her repulsion towards her abuser Apollo, and her unique and steadfast friendship with Eros. The way in which Lore Olympus continually shifts and balances out these many relationships in Persephone's life creates the possibility for love to exist between Persephone and Hades, making a love story without causing any detriment to our understandings of the ancient tale.
But while modern scholars are divided on whether or not it's a good idea in reception to recast Hades and Persephone as a romance, I don't think it's controversial to say that the ancient myth is one of rape, at least by our standards today.
Alright team, it's clearly time for our periodic reminder. Persephone didn't girlboss her way into the underworld, and Hades is not a cute, dark underworld daddy. Persephone was abducted, against her will, by Hades, and like every version of this myth in antiquity, depicts the relationship between these two as non-consensual. But I have way too many people leaving comments that are like, oh my god, Hades is my favorite, he wouldn't do anything wrong, would he? Yeah. And like, all of the myths, except for Lore Olympus.
Whether or not you accept the changing translation, Hades kidnapped her, and then she became his wife. And she was aekuson, unwilling. So, why does this story survive? What is it about this particular myth that not even the Victorians could erase it from the canon? At its heart, I think it's really about how important this story is as an ideology. Which is to say, what it explains about the world. At its core, this is a story of the turn of the seasons. When Persephone goes under the earth, Demeter is sad, and we have winter. And when Persephone returns to the heavens, and they're happy, the world blooms. But it's actually not the only Greek myth that has this explanation for the cycle of seasons. The myth of Adonis does this just as well. I'll get into the details of that in another dissertation chapter, video. But suffice it to say that the Greeks and Romans could have chosen to focus on a male-centered ideology instead of a female-centered one. So what else is compelling about this Persephone story? And here we have to turn to her title as Kore. Kore is just the ancient Greek word for girl, maiden, or daughter. And it's not really a name. So we kind of have to understand it as more of an archetype than a specific goddess. Kore, in her form as Kore, thus is the archetypal daughter. She is under her mother's care until she gets married. This is what happens to daughters when they come of age. They become wives. The Homeric hymn to Demeter is not just an ideology for the turning of seasons, it's also the prototypical wedding. Greek weddings really did look a lot like this. The contract for the marriage would be between the bride's father and either the groom's father or the groom. The couple would be taken from her house to his in a procession in which they were led in a chariot, and the mother was carrying a torch alongside, and the next day they would be showered with fruit. These symbols all are seen in the hymn to Demeter. Really, I can, and maybe at some point if you're interested, I will go on about Greek wedding rituals, but the point is that this is not just a girl coming of age, this is a model for how girls are supposed to come of age. The point is that Persephone's story is one both of being ripped from her old life and of taking up power in her new one. her title of despoina, which means mistress in the sense of like slave mistress, or as dread queen of the underworld, isn't in conflict with her identity as a kidnapped and unwilling bride. It's actually a consequence of it. In ancient Greek eyes, she's grown up. So go ahead and enjoy your modern retellings, whether the story is about a young woman coming of age despite her mother, or a victim reclaiming her power. There's nothing wrong with that. But know that the original myth is a story of rape and assault, and that the cultural context from which it comes doesn't position that as in opposition to female empowerment. In fact, they often came in tandem. And we shouldn't erase that. Keep learning, friends.